Well, I've just managed to give you a backdrop to culture without recording it. And so let me just review a few of these things for you, and then you'll just, instead of watching me write it, the writing is already done. Some culture or some gestures clearly are culturally anchored. The example that was given in your book was from one of our presidents that gave a hand gesture that ended up becoming an insult inadvertently because he didn't understand the context. There are two specific emotions that are common the world over, and that is anger and happiness. And children's facial expressions betray that same thing, is that even those kids without an anchor, and when I say that, I'm talking about blind kids here. In other words, they don't have a visual anchor for what facial expressions are supposed to look like. And those facial expressions are still universal when it comes to happiness and anger, which are the two emotions that are part of something that is universal. Happiness always includes a smile, and anger always includes something like this woman here in the middle, where she's clearly upset. You have the downturning of the mouth and the furrowing of the brow, and all of those, the world over, still seem to be the same thing. The world over. Anyway, the emotional expressions, some would suggest that the emotional expressions that we have are actually adaptive. For example, with surprise, when you act surprised, and when we say that, of course, your face betrays that same thing, your eyes widen, which means that you end up taking in more information visually with surprise, which is adaptive in that sense. The same way with disgust. What happens with the nose and the rest of the mouth, the closing of the mouth, like this guy over here on the far right in the bottom row, it restricts the amount of odor that actually comes into the system. You can see from surprise, this particular gal in the upper row in the middle, what happens with surprise. Her eyes are wide open, mouth is even open. That's part of the surprise itself. The thing to keep in mind as well is how culturally we tend to define emotional display. And in the more individualistic cultures, such as the North American culture and Northern European culture, they value individuality in the display of visible emotions. And so you have a high degree of diversity and a fairly high degree of variety of these visible emotions, because they're emphasizing individual display. And that's part of the backdrop of what we're talking about here. In cultures that are more collectivistic, in other words, the individual is not nearly as important as the collective or the group of the culture itself, what you will see is you see a lot less emotional display, and people adjust to each other. Personal emotions are less visibly displayed, and what you often see as well is that the nuances of emotion are emphasized, and that's what I meant here when I wrote out "eyes still do." The eyes still betray more of what we understand. The other aspect, and this is in a larger context, is just like everything we've been talking about. Emotion is best understood in a biopsychosocial way. There are the biological components, which we've been talking about, the cultural components, social, that's the social cultural, and then the psychological in terms of cognition and how do we explain emotion and how it's displayed generally. So that's a real brief overview. I ended up writing all that stuff out before I got the actual audio running, but you get the nature of it, and we'll move on finally to the actual aspect of facial expressions themselves. All right, one last key question when it comes to emotion display and expressed emotion is our facial expressions, which is a lot of how we determine the context in which emotion actually occurs. And our facial expressions have a variety of output related to it. They also provide a context, because we understand things in context. So you can have a description or a picture of someone who says they're sad, but we perceive them as being far more sad if we see tears in their eyes, or their eyes beginning to show evidence of tears. And so context is quite important, and that characteristic is one of those things that you need to keep in mind, because context was important in perception and in sensation as well, and that's equally true as we move toward more and more social context of what we actually talk about here. When it comes to facial expression, the big question actually is this: facial expressions, do they reflect? So expressions, do they reflect something that is internal? Or do they, facial expression, influence what is internal? And that's very different, because one is passive, the other is more active. And so what you will find is what we refer to as the facial feedback effect. And that's what this diagram at the bottom right down here betrays, is that our expressions of facial expressions amplify emotions for us by activating muscles associated with specific states. And then the muscles signal the body to respond as though we were experiencing those states. So essentially, we can trigger those emotions, or trigger those muscles in your face, and what you tend to feel is the emotions that go along with those muscles being feeling reflects it. So we pull up, in this case, we pull up on these facial muscles on this person's face, and what they report is feeling happy. On the other hand, if we pull down on it underneath his chin, we also see a feeling of sadness that takes over. For example, students who were induced to make a frowning expression reported feeling a little bit more angry. On the other hand, if students were induced to smile by holding a pencil in their mouth with their teeth, what you'll notice is that they felt happier and found cartoons essentially funnier. So what we have is something we refer to as a behavior feedback loop. And so we have the behavior that's emitted, and then the emotions that follow, and then that accentuates the behavior even further, essentially. So if you've ever been in a group of people where somebody gets the giggles, if you will, and that begins to spread throughout the whole body around the whole group, partly because people start laughing at the person laughing. And that is a good experience of what happens with our emotions. What often happens is also a mimicry effect, if you will, and where if I act as another person acts, oftentimes I will feel as another person feels. So actions lead to feelings of the other. And so oftentimes, even in counseling, we see people who have a capacity to empathize, have a capacity, in a sense, toward mimicry, because they incorporate the emotions that the other person is actually feeling. So that wraps up this particular module, Module 36, when we're looking at expressed emotions. We'll turn our attention in the next one when we talk about how we actually experience our emotions and how we understand them in the more psychological context.